Okay, so I think we're ready to get started here. Let me just make sure that everybody can see my screen and everybody can hear me well. Today, we're going to be talking about advanced BPMN tool process modeling. You know that this is just a sequel of the webinar series that we have been presenting about this topic. So a couple of weeks ago, we presented a beginner's course for you to start working with BPMN 2.0. So if you weren't able to attend to that webinar, I would like to quickly show you where you can find the recorded version of our previous webinars. So this is just the ProcessMaker website. You can always visit us at processmaker.com. And as part of the resources that we have here ready for you to review, we have the list of webinars that are scheduled to be presented soon, and also the previous webinars that have already been presented. So you can see the options right here. We have upcoming webinars and past webinars. And here you're gonna be able to take a look at the recorded version of any of our previous webinars. And as part of these webinars, you can find the BPMN 2.0 in a nutshell course that we presented a couple of weeks ago. You just need to click on View Webinar Video and you're gonna be able to access to the recorded session of that event. Okay, so with that said, we're ready to start talking about some advanced process modeling with BPMN 2.0. Before we get started, I would like to thank you all for taking the time to attend this webinar and to join us in this training webinar. And just to remind you that this training webinar is brought to you by ProcessMaker. ProcessMaker's award-winning low-code business process management software makes it easy to rapidly design and deploy automated workflows to deliver true digital agility to your organization. Today, we're going to be working with the ProcessMaker's BPMN 2.0 compliant process modeler. To find more information about this amazing solution, you can always visit us, ProcessMaker, at processmaker.com. Okay, so let's get started here. Some recap related to the previous course we have already presented during the previous course that you can find on our website. We were reviewing basic concepts like, for example, what a business process is. We were talking about how you can identify the processes that are actually taking place in your organization, how to take the idea that you have for these processes and translate that idea into a visual workflow in a process modeler like the one that we're going to be using today. We were explaining how the BPMN 2.0 notation standard was structured, how you use it, why is it so important for you to understand this standard, and how this is going to become a tool for life for you to be able to help any kind of organizations to model any kind of processes. Now, three basic elements that we were reviewing during our previous course were related to the events, activities, and gateways. So what we did in the previous course was to define each of these elements, and we put together like 3 or 4 different processes only using these 3 basic elements. So I know that the complete standard of BPMN 2.0 includes more than 100 elements there, but these are the main categories that you should understand for you to start working with this notation standard, okay? So again, if you need more information about that, you can always take a look at our recorded webinars. And of course, the ProcessMaker documentation also includes plenty of information about these BPMN 2.0 elements. Some information about what we're going to be reviewing today. In today's agenda, we have, first of all, we're going to be talking about subprocesses. I'm going to be giving you the definition of this element. In some BPMN tools, you're going to find them as call activities. That's actually the name that we have in the standard. So whenever you read call activity or subprocess, you're talking about the same element. And what we are going to do today is to review when these elements should be applied. I mean, these are going to be really useful for us to start applying some best practices while we're modeling our processes. These are going to allow us to define a hierarchical structure for our processes. Okay, but we're going to be talking in a more detailed way about this element in a moment. We're also going to be talking about the different types of start events that we're going to be able to find in the ProcessMaker modeler and also in the BPMN standard in general. So these are elements that we have already reviewed during the previous course, but today we're going to put a little more of detailed attention into the different types of elements that we can use. So we're going to be talking about message events, we're going to be talking about timer events, signal events, we're going to be talking about different types of events that we're going to be able to use to model our processes. The same thing in regards to end events. You're going to see the different types that you're going to be able to use for end events and also boundary events. Of course, I'm going to be giving you the basic definition that we have for these elements for you to understand them a little more clear. So just to wrap up today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the verification tools that we have in ProcessMaker. You're going to be able to see how the Process Modeler also includes a verification section where you can actually kind of simulate the workflow that you're going to have for the process model you're building. So we're going to be able to see this amazing feature in a moment. And finally, how ProcessMaker is also going to allow you to generate process documentation related to your processes. We're going to be able to see the information that's included there. We're going to put some emphasis on how important it is to include the descriptions for the elements that we created in ProcessMaker. So this is the last topic that we're going to be covering today. Okay, so let's start with subprocesses. You know that I always like to start with some theoretical information about each of these elements. And once you have at least the basic idea of the elements that we're going to be using, we're going to go to the process modeler and start putting in practice this knowledge. So we're going to be also reviewing different examples related to this element. A subprocess element calls a subprocess that can be reused by other processes in the ProcessMaker instance. So what we're going to basically be doing here is to include another process in a main process structure. The subprocess that this element is going to call is referred as the child subprocess. So that's some of the terms that we're going to be using today. And this must be an external process from the calling process. I mean, we're going to be using a different process. The child process needs to be, of course, in the same instance that we're going to use for ProcessMaker. And maybe the most important features that we need to notice here is that the main process needs to wait until the subprocess is finished before it can continue. Of course, that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes you're going to need the main process to continue as soon as the subprocess starts. So I'm going to be showing you also how to handle that kind of situations. And we're going to be talking about subprocess types as well. As I was mentioning a moment ago, we're going to be working with the different types of start events that we have in the BPMN 2.0 standard. We already know that a start event element starts a request for a process. So this is the initial point for us to consider the workflow that we're going to have for a process. We're going to be talking about other types of start events, like, for example, the start timer event. You can see the icon or the symbol that we're going to be using for that type of events. Just to give you a brief description about this element, a start timer event starts a request for a process at a specific time or a periodic interval. A start timer event element cannot have an incoming sequence flow element because this is going to mark the beginning of a process. And you can use this element to indicate that a request for a process must begin at a specific date and time, such as, for example, if you are working on an employee's anniversary to schedule a performance review, a process model can have multiple start events. So you can have a regular start event like this one, and you can have a start timer event in order to schedule a case to be automatically created in ProcessMaker, and in this case assigned to this specific employee. Now, we're going to be talking about signals today. We're going to be talking about BPMN messages. And maybe the most important thing for us to understand here is the difference between a signal and a message. So right now, I can tell you that you can consider a message. Whenever we hear the word message, we instantly think of an email message or something like that. But in BPM, whenever you talk about messages, you're actually talking about packages of information that are sent from one process to another. So you can consider messages like phone calls when you are going to be sending a specific message to a specific number, right? And whenever you are working with signals, like here, you are actually broadcasting a message for all of the recipients that are interested in reacting to that message. So this will be more like a TV spot, for example, and all of the interested processes are going to react to this signal. So again, whenever you talk about messages, you talk about a message that's been sent to a specific recipient, okay? So it's kind of a one-to-one relationship. And whenever you're talking about signals, you are working with a one-to-many recipients. Okay, so with that being said, you can see that it is also possible to automatically create a case, I mean, start the workflow related to a process based on a signal sent by a different process. Okay, so you can see the difference between the symbols that we're going to be using here. Let me show you the intermediate type or the intermediate event types that we're going to be also reviewing today. So there's a huge difference between the intermediate timer event and the rest of the intermediate events that you're going to be able to find here. The intermediate timer event delays a request for a process until a specific time is completed. So when the specific time occurs, the intermediate event will trigger and then the workflow for that request will resume. You can use this element to cause a request to pause until a specific time. For example, maybe we can use this element to make a request to be paused 30 days before checking if you have received an invoice from a customer or after the services have been rendered and so on. So this is going to actually define a timeout in the middle of your processes. Now, the rest of the intermediate events that we're going to be using today are more related to the messages that we're going to be either throwing or catching. So here, for example, you have the intermediate message catch event, and this is going to pause your process until we receive a specific message from a different process, okay? So here we're going to pause the process until a specific time is complete. And here we're going to pause the process until we receive a message from a different process. Now, I have already mentioned the difference between messages and signals, and you can see that you can work with both of them. You can either expect for a message that specifically targeted to these elements right here, or you can wait for a signal, which is a message that is just broadcasted to all of the processes, and you can establish this point in order to catch that kind of signals. Now, you can also see that with this element right here, you're going to be able to throw a signal. So you're going to be able to broadcast a message to all of the processes, right? And of course, we also have a intermediate message throw event. Now, something really useful for you to notice here and is to know how to differentiate these elements right here. For example, to know when you're expecting a message or when you are sending out a message. So for example, if you can see the difference between these two elements, whenever you see an empty icon, like here, we have an empty triangle, it means that you're expecting a message from another process. And you can see that this envelope is also empty, right? But whenever you see a full icon like this one, we have a full triangle, it means that we are actually sending out a message. We are throwing out a message to a different process. So we're also going to be able to review some examples using these different elements. And finally, the end event types. This is an element that we already know. You know that an end event completes a request for a process. So an end event won't have any outgoing sequence flow. And it's always useful for you to know that a process can have multiple end events. So a request can have multiple possible final statuses, right? You can see that the options that we have for our end events are always going to be related to sending out a message. I mean, we're going to complete the process and send a message for something to happen on a different process. So you have these three options here. The first one is going to send out a message. Again, a message is going to be sent out to a specific recipient. You can also send a signal, which is going to be broadcasted to all of the processes. And you have these two additional options right here. The error end event. I think we were working with an example that used this configuration in our previous course. And today we're going to be able to see another example, of course. And this is going to send out an error message to a different process. This is really useful, for example, if you have a sub-process and you need to know during the main process if the sub-process was completed successfully. So if there was an issue completing the sub-process, which is also going to pause or cause some issues in the main process, then you're going to be able to use these error events in order to notify the main process about that error, and the main process is going to um, be able to handle this kind of errors, right? And finally, just to give you a brief description about this element that we're going to be exemplifying in a moment. Finally, we're going to be talking about terminate and events. So the difference between these two is that this one is going to just end the current thread of the process that you're working on, because as I was mentioning, in a process you can have multiple elements like this one, multiple end events. And this one is just going to terminate the current thread that you are working on right now. And this one is going to terminate all of the threads related to that specific request. So again, we're going to be taking a look at an example of how you should be using these elements that I'm displaying in this brief presentation. Okay, to talk about boundary events, you can see that all of the elements that are related to boundary events, all of them include empty symbols, right? So we're not going to be sending out any message using boundary events. What we're going to do actually here is to interrupt the task that is related to that boundary event. You can see that these boundary events can be related to a regular task. This is a form task or a user task. This is a script task, and this is a subprocess, right? So for example, if we have this task and this is related to approving or rejecting a proposal, we can tell ProcessMaker, or we can define during the process model that we're going to build, that if that action of reviewing a proposal takes more than 3 hours, for example, we can define an alternate workflow that's going to come out of this boundary event. So we're going to be able to define some timing control using these boundary events. You can see that this one is going to work with an error event. I was telling you that, for example, if you're working with a subprocess, if you had any issue while that subprocess was completed, then you can send out an error message that's going to be received by the main process, right? So you can have something like this. For example, here we're working with a script task. So if there was any issue while this script was executed, just to remind you that script tasks are tasks that only execute a piece of code right in the middle of your processes, right? So if there was an error during that execution, then you're gonna be able to throw this kind of error messages. In here, we're gonna be able to define an alternate flow in order to handle this error right here. You can also work with boundary signal events. So if while we are completing this task, we receive this specific signal, then we are going to interrupt this task and we're going to activate an alternate flow again. And finally, you can see that for subprocesses, and when a subprocess is executed, we can also interrupt that execution based on a message, an error event, a timer event, or a signal event. So we have those options right here. The main difference between the standard event types that we have here is the time where they are executed. Start events will always happen at the beginning of your processes. Intermediate events will always happen right in the middle of your tasks. I mean, between the start event and the end event. End events will always happen at the end of your processes. They actually define where a process is going to end and what's going to happen after that's completed. And boundary events happen right in the middle of a task. I mean, while you are working on any of these tasks. Okay, so with that information, we're going to be able to build some more advanced examples. You know that in the previous course, we were working with some basic examples. So I'm going to be giving you some additional examples here. And for that task, we're going to be using the ProcessMaker for Process Modeler. Before I go to ProcessMaker, I would like to remind you that after this presentation, you're going to receive an email including all of the required information for you to gain access to this amazing modeler. And of course, we're going to be sharing with you the recorded version of this course, okay? So let's get down to business again. Let me quickly go to my ProcessMaker instance. Okay, so here we go. Let me just switch to full screen so you can see it a little better. And here we're ready to start working on different examples where we're going to be using the elements we just reviewed. Okay, so the first element that we were mentioning a moment ago were the subprocesses. And for that, I would like to show you how a regular process will look like, okay? So for that, let me quickly create a process here. You know that using this modeler, you only need to provide this process with a name, a description, a category, and you are even able to include a BPMN file. In case you have a process model that has been produced on an external tool, you just need to export it and you can import it in ProcessMaker in order to apply all of the advanced features and the BPM engine that this solution includes for powering that process and start executing requests related to it. So for this, I'm going to be working with a sales process. And for now, let me just use the same process name for the description. And I have a personal category right here that's using my name, right? So let me just create this process and we can start modeling the processes that we're going to be reviewing today. Okay, so for this sales process, we're going to consider something really simple. Maybe we can start just with sales, and you know that we're going to be working with this kind of elements in order to organize the elements that are going to compose this process. Something that you're going to notice a little later is that this element, the pool element, is actually going to allow us to separate different processes that compose a BPMN project. So for example, I'm going to be able to include a second pool here in order to define elements that are going to be part of a different process than the one that's being defined here. Okay, so let me start including elements here. A regular sales process may look like this. So we're going to have a start event. Here, the first task that we need to complete for this process maybe is to send a quote. There we go. We just need to keep on including tasks in the process model that we're going to be using here. Then maybe the negotiation is going to take place. And finally, we can consider making the order, right? There we go. So as we did last time, the only thing that I'm doing here is to take the current knowledge that I have about process that is taking place in my organization, in this case, a sales process, and I'm translating that current information that I have about it as a visual workflow as the one we have here. So I just need to consider all of the tasks that usually take place for this process. And I'm going to be using them in order to automate the process that we're going to have here. So after making the order, maybe we need to generate the invoice, or we can have something like create invoice. Maybe a final task here. And this one should complete the sales process, and this is just going to be related to send this invoice. There we go. So, of course, I'm going to need an end event. And this is just the initial version of this process, right? Something that in our previous course was identified as the happy path that we're going to have for this process. Let me just connect these different elements. You can see that as easy as that, we're going to have a sales process that includes 5 different tasks, and it only took like a couple of minutes to be generated, right? Okay, so this is the most basic version that I have for a sales process. We're going to send the quote, negotiate, make the order, create the invoice, and finally send that invoice. But if you can think a little further of how this process is going to be used, you will notice that some of these tasks are going to be used on different processes. I mean, not only on the sales process. So maybe the initial part, which is related to send the quote, negotiate, and make the order, should become its own process, which could be the maybe unit sales process, right? And this part related to creating the invoice and finally sharing this invoice with the customer could be part of a different process called maybe billing, right? So that's what we should do with any of our processes. I know that during the previous course, we were only working with processes that had one level here, but we should start thinking about grouping these different tasks in order to create different modules that are going to compose all of our processes. So for example, if I take these 2 elements, create invoice and send invoice, we can include them in a different process. So for that, let me save this process. And let me open the process list on a different tab. Okay, so here we have the process list again. And I'm gonna have something like this, billing sub process. Okay, let me keep on using these names as the descriptions just to make this a little faster. And I'm gonna be using my category again. Okay, so this is going to be the billing subprocess, and here I'm going to have something really basic. We're just going to include a start event and the couple of tasks that need to be completed for us to create and share an invoice. Okay, so finally the end event. There we go. So if we remember the names that we had for these tasks, we had make invoice and send invoice, right? There we go. So as we have been able to know this, it's really easy to map this kind of basic processes, just dragging and dropping different elements onto the canvas. And what I have done here is to create a module that's going to be used exclusively for generating and sharing this kind of invoices. So let me just change the name of the pool that I'm using here. And what I'm going to be doing here, and something that's going to be possible from now on, is to include that process into any other main process model. So here, I just need to include a task. And as part of the task types that I can use here, we have subprocess, right? There we go. And in a moment, you're gonna be able to notice that the symbol that we use here is also different. Okay, so you can see the different border that we have for this element. So you can also differentiate tasks and subprocesses. Now here we can have something like billing. And in the process that we're gonna be selecting here, of course, this is part of the process modeler that we're using right now. I just need to select any of these elements and I'm gonna be able to fully configure it here. I just need to select the billing subprocess. There we go. Okay, and you can imagine that I should do the same with this process, with these tasks, right? I should take these 3 tasks and include them in a different module. So that's how you're going to start building different modules or sub-processes that are going to be used in different projects. So if any other project that you may have related to generating an invoice and sharing it with your customers, you can always just call this billing subprocess, right? And you're gonna have everything ready here. And as you may have noticed already, this process is just going to be a regular process. I mean, um, you're gonna be able to include here gateways, different tasks. You can even call a subprocess within another subprocess. You're gonna be able to use the different types of events that we're going to be reviewing in a moment. So any process can be used as a subprocess. I have some questions. I think I just answered to the latest one. Anthony is asking me which tool is this, please. We're using ProcessMaker. This is the ProcessMaker version 4 process modeler. And after this webinar, you're gonna be receiving an email with all of the information you need in order to request for access to this modeler, okay? And finally, Abhishek is asking me, can a subprocess contain another subprocess? Yes. As I was telling you, that's possible. As long as you don't create a loop there, right? But that's just um, common sense for process modeling. Okay, just let me save this subprocess. And let me just give you another example of this. But something that I would like you to notice before we proceed to the next example. Okay, before I continue, I have another question. And my question pertains to the documentation. Is there any way to automatically assign ID numbers to all steps, tasks? Yes. This is going to become really useful for us whenever we start sending messages between the different elements that compose our processes. And you can see that as part of the advanced configuration that you have here, there's an identifier that's automatically generated by the system. And it's unique in this process, right? So these are just some general or standard identifiers that you're going to be using, but you can always change them as you may need. So we can have, for example, something like make invoice task. And from now on, that's going to be the identifier for this node or this element in this process. Okay, so in order to continue here, let me go to the process list. And before I create a new process that's going to be related maybe to hiring an employee, I would like you to notice something right here. And this is the standard behavior that you're going to have for the subprocesses that you're going to be using. Okay, so let me connect these two elements, and I'm just including an additional task here. And this maybe could be related to receiving the payment. There we go. Let me save this. Okay, so here we have a situation that is going to allow us to also review the different types of subprocesses that we're gonna be able to use. Okay, let me make sure that we have answered all of the questions that we have right here. One last question from Anthony. Can you export to Visio from ProcessMaker? Since the ProcessMaker modeler complies with the standard BPMN 2.0, whenever you export this element, you can see that I have the option to download the BPMN file related to this process model. This file can be imported in any external process modeler that works with the BPMN 2.0 standard. So that's why it's really important to work with a process modeler that complies with the BPMN 2.0 notation. Okay, what I was telling you about this is that there are two types of subprocesses that you're going to be able to use in your process modelers. You're going to work with synchronous subprocesses and asynchronous subprocesses. Now, what's a synchronous subprocess? It means that as soon as we start with this process, we're not going to be able to continue with the main process until this subprocess is completed, right? You can notice how the workflow is going to trigger this process and wait until this process is completed before continuing with the next step. Okay, but let me show you another example where we're going to be able to continue with the main process after sending all of the information to here. Okay, but for that, let me save this one. And actually, if you take a look at the documentation that you have for this kind of elements in ProcessMaker, you're gonna also see some very useful examples, receive some technical information about they are going to work at an engine level, for example. But for now, let's focus on the elements that we're gonna be using here. So I was mentioning an employee hiring process. There we go. So as quickly as that, I'm going to be creating a new process here. Here, I would like to also recap on the elements that we have been using. So here, I'm going to actually work with a well-structured process. So for that, I'm going to have a pool. And I'm going to have employee hiring. And I'm gonna be working with 3 different lanes, okay? The first one is going to be related to the HR coordinator, maybe. There we go. Here in the second one, we're going to be working with a secretary. And finally, we can work with an accountant, right? Okay, so I just need to include that here. You can see how easy it is to add elements and configure the different elements that we have here. And here I just need to start dragging and dropping the different elements. So for example, I'm going to be starting with a task assigned to the HR coordinators. For that, let me just get a little more space here. There we go. I have the start event, and I just need to start dragging and dropping the different tasks that are going to compose this process. So we can imagine that we're going to have like 2 tasks that are going to be assigned to the HR coordinator. I'm not going to make this process too complex. So we're going to make an offer. There we go. The second task could be related to maybe receiving the CEO's approval. Okay, if you remember that part of the best practices that we have for process modeling is that whenever we are defining the name that we're gonna have for these tasks, we should always consider a verb noun format for them. So all of these tasks are always going to start with a verb. So you will always find tasks named like make offer, receive CEO's approval, submit form, review form, generate report. So you will be actually trying to describe the type of action that's taking place there. Okay, so here, maybe depending on the approval that we're gonna have here, we can include a decision point, right? We already know how to work with this kind of gateways. This is going to be an exclusive gateway that actually we can use it as a parallel gateway. So as easy as that, I can also change the connection that I'm going to have between these two elements. And I can continue adding tasks to this process. So let me also take the opportunity to remind you how parallel gateways are going to work. You know that whenever you use an exclusive gateway, you can conditionally continue through one of the paths that are going to come out of this element right here. But in this case, we're going to have a parallel gateway, and this is going to allow us to activate all of these tasks right here. So we're going to be working with these three tasks in a parallel way. Let me just align them. I also have the option to align them right here, but they are ready like that. So we can consider this. Write contract, that's going to be assigned to the HR manager. We can have something like field employee register. That's going to be done by the secretary. And finally, this for the accountant, we're going to open an account for this employee. So we can have something like this, open account for employee. Okay, so since we have this ready, I can rejoin the workflow that I have from these three tasks. And why am I spending time on showing you how parallel gateways work? I'm going to use a parallel gateway, I mean one of these elements, in order to modify the default behavior that we have seen on the subprocess that we just created. So I just want you to remember how these elements are going to work. Okay, let me just connect these elements and we should be ready to continue with the main process. Okay, and this should be the end of this process. You can see that even the pool is going to resize to help me organizing these elements. There we go. Okay, so how is this parallel gateway going to work? You know that whenever you're working, again, with exclusive gateways, you're only going to be following one of these paths, right? But if you are working with this parallel gateway, you're gonna be working with all of them. So these three tasks are going to be completed in a parallel way. I think I hit undo. Let me just include the end event here again. So what this element right here is going to do is to make sure that all of these tasks have been completed before continuing to the rest of the process, in this case to the end event. So that's actually how we're going to be making sure that our main process continues even though the subprocess hasn't been completed yet. So this is just going to be a subprocess that we're going to be including in a main process. Okay, so this is employee hiring. Maybe we can have a complete hiring process, or maybe we can call it something like employee recruitment process, and we're gonna be including this. But again, please bear in mind how parallel gateways work. Let me save this. I think I have already saved it. And I'm just going to be creating a main process here. Okay, I can see some questions related to what we have just reviewed. Amos, who's asking, is it possible to get a copy of this training session, please? I would really like to watch it again. Yes, as I was telling you, you're going to receive a link to access the recorded session of this session. Another question from Anjiri, who's asking, can the parallel process see data modified by each other on main makeover form at the end of the parallel gateway? Yes, actually, every time you submit a form, you are modifying the values that you have for the variables that you're using. Of course, this is not part of the BPMN 2.0 standard. That's more related to the BPM engine that you're going to use. But you can imagine that as soon as this task is completed by the HR manager, I think, by the HR coordinator, you're gonna be able to access to that information in these two other tasks. I mean, the values that you have for those variables are going to change. And here, if you would like to generate a final report, this element right here is going to make sure that you count with all of the complete information from these three tasks before generating that final report or before continuing with the process flow. Okay, so let me quickly create this employee recruitment process. And this is the main process that's going to include the employee hiring process we just put together. Okay, so what's going to happen if we have something like this? I mean, we have already seen how to work with different modules that are going to compose our processes. That employee hiring can be considered a module that can be included in any other main process model, right? So here, let me just change the name that I have for this pool. I know that employee recruitment and employee hiring is practically the same, but we're just putting together some examples in order to see how these two processes are going to interact. So this main process is going to be composed of three different modules, and each module is going to work with its own process. So here we're going to be working with a module related to finding a new employee. Here we're going to be working with the employee hiring. You can imagine that here's where we're going to be including the process we just created. This needs to be as a process. Okay, and finally, we can consider a training process, right? This is also going to be a subprocess. Here we can have something like train employee. There we go. So this is the new standard that we have for processing or for modeling our processes, right? We now know how to work with these different modules. And this is going to make putting together this kind of processes easier than actually modeling the complete set of elements that are going to compose these 3 steps, right? So let me save this for now. And for hire employee, we have this process, employee hiring process, right? Okay, so what I was trying to show you here is that this is just the usual behavior that we already know for subprocesses, right? We start a new request here, we execute this complete process, then we execute this one, finally the train employee process, and we finish with the employee recruitment process. But we have already mentioned that these are synchronous subprocesses, right? I mean that we need to wait for them to be completed in order to continue. But what if we would like to work with an asynchronous subprocesses? So we can send all of the required information to this subprocess, but continue with the main process. So for example, before I make the required modifications here, let me include another task here so you can see it a little better. So I'm going to include a regular task here. And this is going to be related just to generate a final report about this employee recruitment, okay? So we're going to connect these elements. Okay, and please remember what we're trying to do here. I want to send the complete information in order to hire this employee, but I want to continue with the main process. I mean, I want to start training this employee. I know that maybe doesn't make sense, but to train an employee that we haven't hired yet, but I want you to see how I'm going to modify that behavior. So for that, let me get rid of these connections right here. And what I'm going to do is to enable a parallel path that's going to work like this. And the element that's going to come to save the day is actually a parallel gateway. And I'm going to connect these elements like this. Okay, I'm going to use the same element. Again, if you remember the best practices for process modeling, if you're using a parallel gateway here in order to divide the workflow that you're going to have, you need to use the same gateway type in order to rejoin this workflow. Okay, so let me show you how this is going to look like now. And you can see how this is going to work from now on. So in the past, we used to send all of the information to the hire employee or the employee hiring process. And we had to wait for this to be completed before we are able to train the employee, right? But if you work with this kind of a structure, applying a parallel gateway here, you're gonna be able to send the information here, and at the same time, you're gonna be able to continue working with the main workflow that you have for this process. So you can find an employee, and while you are doing all of the paperwork to hire this employee, you can start training this employee and generating this final report. Okay, so you don't have to wait for this to be completed. And again, I know that maybe it doesn't make sense to train an employee that hasn't been hired yet, but what I want you to see is how I'm going to define an asynchronous subprocess in a structure like this. Okay, so we have already solved this question. Let me just close them. Okay, so that in regards to subprocesses, I would like you to also be able to see the different event types that we're going to be reviewing today. So let me close this. I need to make sure that I'm going to save it. And let me quickly create a new process here. So and maybe these event types are not that hard to understand, but I would like you to see some real life examples for you to know when you're supposed to use them. So maybe we can begin with a start timer event example. There we go. So what I was telling you about timer events is that they're going to work with a specific period of time or a specific interval of time, right? And if you're going to have a timer start event, you're going to be able to create automatically a new request after a specific interval of time or maybe at a specific date and time. So if we can include some examples here, let me include a pool first. So you can imagine, for example, if we can think of some examples, if you're going to put together a process that's going to define the initial tasks that should be completed for all of your employees at the beginning of the day. So you can define something like here, like this. So this is going to start timer event. And as I was telling you, this is going to happen every day. So you can see the configuration that we can do here. Of course, again, this is just part of ProcessMaker. The BPMN 2.0 standard just defines how this element is going to work. And this configuration right here is defined by the BPM solution that you're using, in this case, ProcessMaker. Okay, and here they are gonna have the different tasks that they have to complete, right? Maybe they need to clock in. They need to check their to-do list. There we go, and so on, right? So this is an example of how you will be using a daily start event. There we go. So here you can keep on including new tasks. Maybe we can think of Another example here, maybe the IT support service that we can offer. And let me just get a little more space for you to be able to see the complete process model that I'm going to be putting together here. This is going to be for an IT specialist. So for this IT specialist, we're going to create a new request for all of our IT specialists for them to complete a routine every 2 hours. So start timer event, and this just to give you an example. So what we're going to have here is the routine that they need to complete. For that, we're going to be including the different tasks that they have to complete in a regular way, right? Okay, so maybe we can have something for something like check email inbox. Maybe review the most important issue. Okay, and send the first response to that issue. Okay, so as I was telling you, we're going to be able to have this kind of start events. This one is going to happen every day. So we can have something like this. Daily. And we can have something like every 2 hours. There we go. Okay, let me see, I have a question here. Is there a way to assign the timing control for the timer event dynamically rather than statically? All of the configuration that we're going to have here is static, since you are defining actually a process structure. But if you would like to have something a little more dynamic, I mean, to be able to control when these cases are going to be triggered, I will advise you to work with either message events or signal events. So on a different process, you're going to actually be able to define when these cases are going to be triggered. And in that process, you're going to be able to use different logical conditions, different intermediate events, and so on. But in this case, whenever you're working with this kind of start timer events, you're going to have something static. Okay, but in a moment, we're going to be working with message events and signal events. And I hope that that's going to become a little more clear for you. Okay, and finally, let me just show you how a static date and time example will work in a structure like this. Let me just include a third pool here. And here we're going to have something like this. Something like performance assessment 2020. So that's supposed to happen at the end of this year, right? So for that, I'm going to have something like this. Let me include a couple of tasks just for it to be a little more understandable. Okay, let me connect these elements. Okay, and this is going to happen on December the 31st, 2020 at, I don't know, 9 a.m. ET. Okay, so at this specific date and time, I'm going to be creating a new case for this process, which is going to be related to the performance assessment that I'm going to have at the end of this year, right? So that configuration can also be done here. And of course, this needs to be a timer event. Let me change the type here. And as part of the timing control, you're gonna be able to select a static date, right? Okay, so just as part of the configuration, just trying to stick to the standard that we're reviewing during this session, we should include when this event is going to be triggered. So that's why I'm including this kind of descriptions, daily, every 2 hours, and the specific date and time. And maybe we're gonna be completing different tasks like get report or get performance. There we go. We're gonna get a performance review form. Here we're going to be filling it out. Okay, let me just not get too complex with these tasks. Fill out form and maybe share feedback. Okay, that's it. But this is going to happen at this specific time and date, right? And you're gonna be, of course, assigning this first task to the person that you would like to start working on this case. And you can see that this is really useful in order to define how cases or requests are going to be automatically created. In the first example, on a daily basis, every 2 hours, or at a specific date and time. So that's how you're gonna be working with this kind of start timer events. Okay. For the next example that I'm going to put together, I would like to start talking also about the different types that we're going to have for end events. What I was telling you is that it is possible to send out a message or a signal whenever you complete a process, right? So let me show you how that's going to work, how that's going to look like, and how that's going to be applied to the advanced process models that you're going to have. Okay, so I can imagine an invoice payment process that's going to work with these different elements. There we go. I'm going to use my category again. And here, I'm going to have two different options to end this process. As I was describing during the initial presentation, a process can have multiple end events, and that's exactly what's going to happen here. So let me include a pool, and I'm going to start adding different elements here. I can even work in a more structured way using two lanes in order to classify the tasks that I'm going to be including here. Okay, so let me first of all change the name of this pool. Invoice payment. There we go. Again, I'm going to hide the menus. Maybe we can even go full screen. And I just need to start including elements here. Okay, for the main process, I'm going to be working with a regular start event or an empty start event, as it is called in the standard. And here we're going to be starting the invoice payment. There we go. And I just need to define what's going to happen next. Before we continue, let me also define who's going to be taking care of these tasks. Here I'm going to have a secretary. And here I'm going to have the requester. Perfect. Okay, let me include a new task here, which is going to be related to receiving the invoice. And another task, this one is going to be assigned to the requester. Maybe we're going to be working with the invoice approval. So I'm going to have something like this. Okay, you can notice that in a matter of minutes, we can put together processes like the ones that we're using as an example here. So this is something really common related to approval processes. I mean, having this kind of gateways in order to review if this request was approved, right? So it's also a good practice to include this kind of labels so we can immediately know what's being evaluated here. Okay, so here we're going to have two optional paths. One, if the invoice gets approved, and one in case it has been rejected. So again, please pay special attention to how these elements right here, the gateways, are helping me define this kind of conditional flows. So in case this is not approved, I can also include that text label here, which is going to be really useful for the person that's trying to read this map. Let me save it. Then we may have to request for changes. There we go. And if it is approved, maybe we can check the company. Okay, so now here at this point, I'm about to reach the end of this process. And for that, you can see that I'm still working with two different threads, right? Two different paths that can define a different final status for this request. So here, let me just include a final gateway. Okay, maybe we can directly work with something like this, so we don't make this process too complex. So what I was mentioning is that a process can have multiple end events, just like this one. And here we're going to be working with two different types of end events. Let me just connect these elements. And this is what's going to happen. So what I was mentioning about these elements, the empty end event elements, is that these are just going to end the current thread that's being working on. I mean, if we are working with a request like this, at this point, we're only going to terminate this thread. But if we don't have like something like this exclusive gateway, for example, if we have a parallel gateway, this thread is going to continue unless we have something like this. We can change the type that we're going to have here, and we're going to change it to terminate end event. So in this case, we're going to be closing all of the threads related to this request. So if we have parallel ways here, if we have multiple threads, if we have different structures of conditions that are being handled here, with this element right here, we're going to terminate all of them. And here, what we're going to do is to actually send out a signal. There we go. Okay, so as I was mentioning during the initial presentation, this is actually going to broadcast a message that's going to be sent out to all of the processes interested in reacting to that message. Okay, so we can have those two options, and here I'm going to define the different options of processes that can react to this signal right here. So for example, we can have a process that's going to be automatically triggered by that signal. And this can be related maybe to process the payment. Okay, and here we can work with two different lanes. And as I was telling you, this is going to be triggered by the signal that we are broadcasting in this process right here. In a moment, I'm going to show you the complete process model for you to review it. Here I can have some tasks or a complete process that's going to be completed or that are going to be completed by the account payable assistant maybe. There we go. In here, maybe we can define something like an administrative, okay? So again, we're not getting too complex with this. I just want you to see how I'm going to be working with this kind of elements. Here, I'm gonna have a signal start event, okay? And you can see that I can establish the specific signal that I'm going to be using here, but again, that's more related to the BPM engine that the current solution offers, right? So just trying to stick to the standard that we're using today. This is how you're going to define an outgoing signal and a start event that's waiting for a signal in order to trigger an automatic request. Okay, here we can have, well, all of the structure that we will need for a process like this. So maybe we can include a exclusive gateway like this one. We're gonna have two conditional paths. So maybe we can work based on the payment options that we're gonna have for this. We already know how to structure this kind of conditional paths. Okay, what I was mentioning, this is going to depend on the payment option. And if I'm going to be using an exclusive gateway here, I need to use an exclusive gateway here as well. There we go, and that could be the end of this process right here. Let me just include an end event here. Okay, here we're gonna have a general check. And here we're gonna have a bank transfer, okay? There we go, and this is going to be triggered by this signal. And as I was telling you, this is going to send a general message to all of the processes, even they are in this same project or if they are contained on a different project. So it's not a requirement for them to be working within the same project. Okay, here please just let me include a couple of elements and we can continue with explanation of the next element that we have to review today. Just to complete this example. Okay, perfect. And these tasks are going to be completed by an administrative. Right here, maybe we can check the documentation, we can send it to the revenue agency, and so on. But the main thing that I would like you to notice here is how this part of the project or these two processes or these two groups of elements are going to react to what's going to happen here. Here we are working with an invoice payment, and there are two possible end events that can be executed here. We can either terminate this complete request, or we can send out a signal that's going to trigger these two flows right here. One for the account payable assistant, and finally one for the administrative. Okay. I have a question from Anthony who's asking, are you going to use message flows today? Yes. The next element actually is related to message flows. And I would like you to see how we're going to define who's going to be the recipient of that message and how we're going to be defining the specific message that our process is going to be waiting for. Okay, answer live. Somebody is telling me that they're having problems with the audio connection. Please let me know if you can hear me well. Okay, let me check the chat. I can hear you well, loud and clear. Perfect. Okay, so let me continue here. We are reviewing the different types of elements that we have related to the events that can take place in our processes, right? So I would like to start talking about message events. And for that, we have already seen how to work with signal events. We have reviewed how to work with timer events. Now it's time to start talking about message events. And for that, we're going to be working with some intermediate events. Just let me go back to the process list in order to create a new process. I think I only have a purchase order process here, but we're going to create our own version of it. Purchase order process. Then I just include something like message events. There we go. We're ready to start working on this project. So this is not so different from what we have done with signal events, but as I was telling you, I will need you to pay special attention to how we're going to define the message IDs and how you're going to be making graphic the information flow that you're going to have between elements in this project right here. So let me include a pool as always. And the messages that you are going to be using here are always going to be used to send information from one pool to another. So that's the main function that you're going to have for a process. And whenever you see a message event on any process model, you're going to see how they are used to define the interaction between two different pools or elements contained in two different pools. So let me change the configuration that I'm going to have for these pools. We can work with a main purchase order process. And here we're going to have all of the tasks and elements required for the purchase fulfillment, okay? Okay. I think I have an additional L here. There we go. Okay, so let me start including the different elements here. Again, I won't get too complex with these processes because I just need you to know how you're going to be using the intermediate message events. So I'm thinking of including a message throw event here, and here a message catch event. And we're going to have something like this. A regular start event. We can think of a couple of tasks that need to be completed in the main purchase order. And maybe we can have an exclusive gateway here. Okay, so this is the main structure that I'm going to have for this purchase order process. Let me start naming these tasks in order to make it a little more understandable. So here we're going to submit the request. Here we're going to verify the payment. Submit purchase order. There we go. That makes a little more sense. Here, what we're going to be evaluating is the payment verification. And here we're going to have two options. We can either loop back to the purchase order step in case we need to add more information to it, or maybe we have to consider any required change in this order, in this purchase order, before we can continue. And this is also something that we have reviewed during the previous course, right? This kind of structures or elements are going to allow you to do or define this kind of loops in order to make sure that you count with the complete information and to make sure that all of the information that you have is correct before you can continue with the rest of the workflow. Okay, so let me just get some more space here. Okay, I have a couple of questions here. Philip is asking me, did I miss how you are linking the signal send and signal start? Actually, if you are working with the main palette that we're using for these BPM elements, a signal event is going to broadcast a message that's going to be sent to all of the processes. So you won't have the necessity to make graphic how you're going to link the signal send and the signal start events. Because as I was telling you, these are not really sent out to a specific recipient. There won't be that specific connection, but you're gonna be broadcasting that message to all of the processes. Okay, I have another question from Abhishek, who's asking, I'm not sure how it will start the specific process based on signal. Is there any configuration to start a specific process? Okay, Abhishek, maybe in a moment we can go back to the previous example. And as part of what's related to the notation, that's how you're going to define the signal events, but as part of the BPM engine that ProcessMaker includes, I'm going to show you how to define the signals that you're going to be using for those events. But for now, please, let's continue with this event, and I'm going to get back to signals in a moment. So let me quickly complete this element right here. What I was telling you is that I'm going to be throwing a message right here. And that's going to be the end of this process. Okay, let me change the name that I have for this draw message event. I'm gonna have something like draw to fulfillment. There we go. So you're going to notice that it's going to be really useful to name this kind of elements because that's the name that we're going to use in order to identify this message. You can see that as part of the configuration that I have for this element, I can define a message name. So I'm gonna have something really similar, draw to fulfillment. Of course, I can use the standard name that the modeler will give to this element, but this is going to be way more understandable than using the standard name, yeah, right, or the generic name that we have. Now for the purchase fulfillment, we're gonna have something like this. This is just going to be a regular process. Let me include a couple of elements here and also expand this pool. Just a task and an end event here. That's going to complete this process. Okay, let me connect this element. You can see that I'm leaving this part empty because in a moment I'm going to be showing you how we can include an intermediate event there. Okay, so we have two options here. Let me just name these tasks so they become a little more clear. Maybe we're gonna have the preparation of the purchase fulfillment. Fulfill order, and finally, we can just ship the order. Okay, so here we have two options. If, for example, if we will need to trigger automatically a case to be created at this point of the main process, that you can imagine that we can include that as many tasks we need here. What we will have here is something like this. Now, please pay special attention that I'm not going to use a sequence flow in order to define how these two elements are going to be connected. I'm going to use a message flow. You can see that this is a dashed connection. You can see it right here. And you have two options here as well. You can just make graphic that this message is going to be sent to this pool. Or maybe if you would like to be a little more specific, you can just connect it to this element. But of course, please let me cancel that connection. Of course, for that, this need to be a message start event, right? Okay, so again, if you are working with this kind of elements, it's really easy to know when a message is being sent out or when you are expecting a message in order to continue. You can see this full envelope here. That means that you are sending out a message, and you can see this empty envelope here. That means that you are waiting for a message in order to create a case here or to create a new request. Now, again, I'm going to use the message flow. And what I was telling you is that you can connect this directly to the complete pool, as you can see right here. Or maybe you can be a little more specific and connect it to the element that we have here. Okay, let me just make this connection. This is kind of tricky considering the resolution of the screen that I'm using. There we go. Okay, so that's how you're going to define these connections. So if you remember, we weren't doing this procedure for signal events because we were trying to send out that signal to many recipients. So you won't have this specific connection. And the signal recipients can choose to react or not to the different signals that they are going to catch. So that's why you don't need to make graphic that connection. Okay, but what I wanted to tell you here is that, for example, the same behavior that you have here, where you are just submitting a purchase order and verifying the payment, in order to complete the main event, you can actually get the same behavior using a subprocess, right? So you will just need to include a subprocess here that could include all of these elements, and you're gonna get the same behavior. But the additional functionality that you're going to get using this kind of message events is that you're gonna have a more flexible way in order to define when a message is going to be sent out and when a message is going to be received. What I mean is that, for example, if we cancel that connection, if we get back to an empty start event, we can decide that this process is going to start as any other process. But at this point right here, we're gonna pause this process until we receive a message from the purchase order process. So here we can have something like a message catch event. And as I was telling you, we should always try to include this kind of labels. Catch from order. Okay, so again, you can see the difference between these two elements. You can see that I have a full envelope here in order to send out a message and an empty envelope here in order to receive a message, right? And again, I'm gonna be using a message flow. Again, we can directly connect these two elements or just make a connection between this element right here with the complete pool. So you have those two options as well, depending on the message flow that you are trying to make graphic here. Okay, and just to finish up with this explanation or the explanation related to this element, please notice that the message name that I'm using here is the same message name that I'm going to configure here, right? Draw to fulfillment. So in this configuration, we're gonna have the list of all of the message events or message throw events that we have in this project right here for us to define the specific message that we are waiting for. Okay, so let me save this. And before I get back to the signals example, just to give you a summary of this section. Again, whenever you see a full icon, you're sending out a message. Whenever you see an empty icon, you're waiting for a message. Here, if you see the process flow that we have, we're going to complete this task, and then we're going to pause this process until we receive this message. So that's a requirement for us to continue. Okay, now that you have how these messages are going to be identified, let me go back to the signals example that we had, that, if I'm not mistaken, was related to the invoice payment process. And what I was mentioning about signals is that if you consider that messages need to be sent to an element that's contained within the same project, these kind of elements are going to be sent out to all of the processes that you have in this environment. So if you can see the configuration that we have here, you're going to be able to create different signals. And why they are not listed here? Because you're not only considering the signal events that you have in this project, but you're going to be creating signals that are going to work at an environment level. So signals that are going to be available for all of the processes in this list. And that's also why you don't need to make graphic how they are going to be connected, because you could be representing a connection between this process and this one, right? So they don't need to be in the same project. Okay, so just to close the topics that we have to cover today, I would like to just to show you how the validation tool is going to work here in ProcessMaker, and also how the documentation is going to be generated by ProcessMaker. So something really simple to see here. Maybe we can use any of these examples. This is a complete example related to a leave of absence process. This is a process that's already running, where all of the notifications, all of the assignment rules have been defined, and so on. And something really useful for you whenever you go from the process modeling stage to the stage where you're going to start executing requests for these processes, you're going to find this tool really useful, the check flow tool. So what this is going to do is actually to make a simulation of the workflow that you're going to be following here. You can see how we're going through the different nodes, and you can see how the different options are going to be considered here. Right? So for example, here we have a flow that should be reviewed, maybe related to the different options that we have configured here. And well, we don't have any errors here, but in case you have a process modeling error or something that needs to be changed for this to work properly, then you're gonna be also able to see those error messages here. So this is going to become really useful whenever you are working on a process model and you don't need to wait to start creating requests in order to identify any bottleneck or any potential error that you're going to get with this model. Let me go back to the process list. And finally, just the documentation that you have for these processes. As we were mentioning, the documentation is the perfect complement that you're going to have for a great modeler. You already have the modeler, you have the great BPM engine that ProcessMaker offers, and just to wrap up the process modeling lifecycle, you will need to generate a document like this one. So for example, what you're going to be able to find here are all of the elements that are going to compose this process, and that's why it's really important for you to start adding this kind of descriptions. Of course, there's the possibility of also including the process map here. So those are just some additional options that this modeler is going to offer you. But as for today's presentation, we were able to review some advanced elements that you can use for your process models, right? So let me go back to the presentation, and I think we're ready to wrap up this session. There we go. Okay, so thank you all for joining me today. Hopefully we're gonna meet again in a future training webinar. We'll make sure that you receive access to the recorded version of this event and complete information about how to access to this modeler. You're gonna get all of that information in a moment in an email. And remember that to find more details about it and more content like this, you can always visit us at processmaker.com. And if you have any further questions, inquiries, you can always reach us at info@processmaker.com or training@processmaker.com, or even at my personal email address, which is giovanni@processmaker.com. We're always glad to help customers, leads, and users of ProcessMaker that are out there using our solution. Okay, so thank you all and have a great day.